next speaker is Dean Broyles. He is a constitutional attorney who serves as the President and Chief Counsel of the National Center for Law and Policy. He is a graduate of Westmont College and Regent University School of Law. He was trained in constitutional litigation by Jay Sekulow of the American Center for Law and Justice, and does a lot of work with the Alliance Defending Freedom. Dean is admitted to practice before the U.S. Supreme Court. He is actively engaged in fighting the good fight for faith, family, and religious freedom in courts and culture. Dean has handled many important legal cases and key projects involving public education over the past 21 years, including student free speech, religious student clubs, parental rights, teachers' rights, and relevant to our time this evening, supporting concerned parents fighting the egregious child-corrupting sex ed program in the San Diego Unified School District, as well as advising school districts and parents statewide regarding SB 48 and the History Social Science Framework. Dean is a member of the legal team representing us at the U.S. Supreme Court challenging AB 775, he can talk more about that, NIFLA versus Becerra, which targets and compels PCCs to advertise for the abortion industry. Dean has been married to his wife Shona for 29 years, who is a public school teacher. They live with their 3 adopted children here in San Diego in Escondido. Without any further ado, would you please welcome Dean Broyles, our next speaker.
All right, give me a second to rearrange a couple things and I'll be right with you. Okay. All right, I love it when technology works. So, hey, thank you for being here tonight. I'm going to have to talk quick because we have a lot to get through in a short amount of time because I want to make sure we have plenty of time for Q&A. Let me pray quickly. Lord, I pray that tonight the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts together would be pleasing and glorifying and honoring to you, Lord. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So today I'm just going to go through 4 or 5 main points with a lot of information, and then if for some reason you don't get something because I'm going too fast, I'll give you my PowerPoint later, okay? So anything you miss or you want to ask questions about later, you can, but I'm going to go quickly, but this PowerPoint will be available. I'll send it to anybody who wants it. First of all, I'll talk about how I became involved in this process. As a civil rights attorney, what am I doing being kind of a community organizer and helping parents fight this issue on a local level. The radical, beautiful truth about sex, because sometimes when we talk about the ugly curriculum, it's important to remember what's the model, what are we shooting for, especially in the body of Christ. The cultural context, kind of an overview of how we got here so quickly in our culture in the last 30 to 40 to 50 years. And then how comprehensive sexuality education instruction distorts truth and corrupts our children. As you were pointing out a minute ago, it's really the idea of objective truth versus subjective or personal truth or feelings, especially with the transgender issue. And how extreme sex ed is going to be infused, as was hit by Ashley a few minutes ago, throughout the curriculum in California, not just in sex ed courses, but in history, social science, and in the health curriculum coming out. Really quickly, how I became involved. Before I was called to law school, I was a youth director, so I worked a lot with junior and senior high youth. And I'm the father of 3 teenagers in this crazy culture. So I'm trying to figure out, as a dad, how do I raise and train and catechize my kids and have them prepared to meet what's happening today in the culture. And so I think about these issues a lot. And a lot of this involves issues I've litigated in the past and currently working on. I was heavily involved in Prop 8, the effort to protect the man-woman definition of marriage in California, was ultimately reversed at the Supreme Court in Obergefell versus Hodges. And we filed an amicus brief in that case representing parents and friends of ex-gays and gays. So I worked a lot with the former homosexual community for decades. I've been involved heavily through Alliance Defending Freedom with what we call SOGI training, dealing with all the emerging laws in the past 5 to 10 years regarding issues of sexual orientation and gender identity. We have an amicus brief pending before the U.S. Supreme Court in a case that we're hoping the court takes any day now. In the case of Doe versus Boardtown, it's the situation that Ashley mentioned, but in a high school where you have people feeling unsafe to go into their own locker room or bathrooms because of transgender use of those facilities. We filed a brief on behalf of Dr. Ryan Anderson of the Heritage Foundation, who wrote the book When Harry Became Sally, talking about our transgender moment, and I highly recommend that to everybody in this room. It's a must-read book for all of us as we're dealing with now moving on past the homosexual issues in marriage to now pushing transgenderism in the last 3 years since same-sex marriage was legalized at the U.S. Supreme Court. Involved heavily in what we call the wedding vendor cases at the Supreme Court. That was the Masterpiece Cake Shop case of Jack Phillips in Colorado and Arlene's Flowers in Washington State. Unfortunately, we won Jack's case at the U.S. Supreme Court, so that was a good victory for free speech and religious liberty last year. The AB 775 case, I needed to update my introduction slightly. We're also involved in that, protecting pro-life pregnancy care centers that were attacked and targeted by state law here in California. But we won that case, so that's a victory we got under our belt last year too. Have worked a lot, as I mentioned earlier, with former homosexuals and transgenders. And one of the neat things that's happening just in the last year in California, with opposition to AB 775 last summer and some other laws that were coming against the church, is that there's really been a coming out of the former homosexual and former transgenders who have been have overcome their same-sex attraction usually because they've come to Christ. And so they're actually the most marginalized, hated people in America, because they showed the lie that exists that you're born gay and you can't change, and that's simply not true. And I've worked with that community for a long time, so I'll talk more about that in a minute. And how I got involved specifically in San Diego is I got calls from 2 or 3 different parents and moms and community members who, as the curriculum was starting to roll out and become known, were very horrified. And once I saw the curriculum, at first I said to myself, I really probably don't have time with my caseload to get involved in a local public policy issue like this. But once I saw the curriculum and heard what was in it and started understanding what was in it, I could not turn away. I could not walk away from helping these parents. And so Ashley and I have become good friends, and I'm honored to represent the concerned parents of San Diego. Talk a little bit about the truth, the radical, beautiful truth of sexuality, okay? This is radical now because it's become so countercultural. And what we need to understand, if you're a Bible-believing Orthodox Christian today, your beliefs, especially your beliefs on human sexuality, are radically countercultural. And so what I want to say tonight to you is welcome to the revolution. You are now the hippies, okay? The sexual cultural revolution has come full circle now to our children, and now we're getting engaged because it's starting to hit us at home. And we need to get engaged, as Ashley mentioned. It's very important. So a couple verses I just want to mention here, really important in a lot of the work that I do in my thinking, is Genesis 1:27. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. And it's the image of God that gives us dignity and worth. We're not just a plant or an animal or a tree. We're God, the pinnacle of God's creation, and God created us intentionally and purposefully and designed us to be male and female, and that's very important. And then Matthew 19:5, Jesus affirms that when he says, "For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh." A couple key points, and I could go on this for hours. I ended up actually writing the biblical talking points for marriage, so that pastors during Prop 8 could start talking about marriage and biblical marriage from the pulpit. That's how, so when we talk about these issues, I don't assume that any pastor or any church is actually dealing with these issues openly, because the church, the culture has really pressured the church into silence and withdrawing in a lot of these areas. So, it's kind of weird for me theologically as an attorney to be writing biblical talking points for pastors, but that's what I ended up doing. And by God's favor and grace, they loved them and they were used all over the state to start talking about biblical marriage again, okay? But truth, as was mentioned earlier, is that this is really fundamental, is the idea of objective truth versus subjective truth, objective truth and reality versus relativism. That's one of the biggest fights here, because ideas have consequences, and this is where it all starts. Truth, we need to understand, is that which corresponds to reality, and it's objective, it's outside of ourselves, it's not subjective. I mean, you can feel feelings very strong, but that doesn't make your feelings true, okay? That's a real important concept to understand in our crazy, mixed up world today. I say to my wife all the time, we've lost our bloody minds. I mean, it's almost like we're going insane as a culture. The second part of that's important is the Imago Dei, that we're created in God's image. And as I mentioned earlier, that's what gives us dignity and worth. Male and female, there are only two genders, as opposed to the LGBTQ plus, what we call the queer gender spectrum, okay? That whole gender spectrum, it's not biologically true, it's not genetically true, it's not true on any level except in people's feelings and their thoughts, but there's no objective truth to it. So we've got to resist anything that says, oh, we're the new truth, we're the replacement truth. But we need to look for evidence. What's the evidence of that truth besides your feelings and besides this cultural moment that we're in? Okay? There's and by the way, you can't change your gender, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. Marriage is one man, one woman for life. Okay? That's a biblical model. And it's a good and beautiful thing. I'm about to celebrate 30 years of marriage, and it's been a blessing in my life and very, very stabilizing in my life. Sex is good and beautiful. And all this stuff we need to be teaching to our children regularly, talking to our children regularly about. Part of the reason that this sex education program is such a threat to us is that we've done a very bad job of teaching our kids these issues. We're not talking about this from the pulpit very often. We're not talking about this in youth group. Christian parents, unlike Ashley, are not always regularly talking to their kids about these issues from a biblical, objective perspective, and we need to do a much better job of that. Out of context, okay, sex can be very harmful and destructive, both personally and culturally. So God's moral rules and moral laws are like gravity. You can think you can fly, I can think I'm a woman, I can think I'm a toaster, but at some point, God's moral law, like natural law, kicks in, and I'm going to fall to earth. And I'm going to, the moral law built into the universe, baked into the cake of how we live, is if I oppose it, it's going to kick my butt every time. So out of context, that's why sex is harmful, destructive, and personally and culturally. So sex as a sport, as Ashley mentioned, is not a good thing. And we need to resist that with everything in our being if we want to have healthy kids and healthy grandkids and have a future as a culture. God's way, as I already have mentioned, currently in our cultural moment, is radically countercultural. And you need to accept that, embrace that, and be okay with that. And even if they end up calling you names, okay? And I've been debating these issues for 23 years. And very, very rarely am I ever called hateful or bigoted, but I'm willing to be called hateful or bigoted if that's what it takes to speak the truth in love. Because that's what Ephesians 4:15, what Paul says we need to be doing as believers, is speaking the truth in love. Not withholding the truth, thinking we're being nice to people. Okay, we need to be radical, countercultural hippies for Jesus right now. So how did we get here? There's a lot of things we could talk for hours about this, but I'm just going to hit some high notes or low notes, I guess. Alfred Kinsey is one of the worst. He was a perverted sex researcher who in the late 40s and early 50s, he was an activist trying to undermine the Judeo-Christian worldview about sex, and he did all sorts of disgusting and flawed research that led to all sorts of beliefs. Some of you may have heard the idea bandied about, that's been disproven multiple times, that homosexuals, gays and lesbians are 10% of the population. Well, where did we come up with that? Who came up with that idea? It was Alfred Kinsey. The real number is at most 2 to 4% of the population. But for decades, people believed it was 10% because Alfred Kinsey was this, researcher who everybody trusted. And now that his research has been picked apart, it's been shown that he can't be trusted. So he started trying to overthrow all the ideas about sex and really the Judeo-Christian worldview, okay? But not just the Judeo-Christian worldview. I mean, even if you're not a Christian, a lot of other world religions have rules and morals and ethics about sex, right? That are in line, in many cases, with the Judeo-Christian worldview. And so these ideas are offensive to a lot of people in our culture today, not just Christians. So then, after Alfred Kinsey came along, the hippies and Woodstock, and yes, I blame a lot of what's happening in our culture today on the hippies, although I think hippies are cool in a lot of ways too. I was too young to really remember a lot of the hippies. I was born in 1967, so I was around during those times, but I don't remember a lot of it. But a lot of the ideology of the hippies, were very relativistic, right? If it feels good, do it, right? It was a very self and pleasure-focused time, and that's when the sexual revolution really took off publicly in America. Ideas of if you're not with the one you love the one you're with. Really, that's kind of sex as a sport, right? That's the idea that sex is primarily pleasureful for your own benefit, to make you feel good, and so have sex with whomever you want, whenever you want, and there's really no restriction to it. And that's really the worldview. It's a hippie sexual worldview that's really come full circle now. That's now being taught to our children in school. The rise of the porn industry. We see in the late 50s, late 50s, early 60s, and really taking off in the 70s. The rise of the pornography industry. Playboy, Penthouse, Ralph. Who is the founder of Playboy?
Hugh Hefner.
Yeah, Hugh Hefner was very influenced by Alfred Kinsey, and so you see, you can trace the historical roots of all this, and all these people kind of were influencing each other and pushing the envelope farther and farther and farther. But those are the good old days when, I call them the good old days, when pornography was only primarily in magazines and maybe some books, and you had to go to certain bookstores to buy them. Now pornography's everywhere. It's on your phone, it's on your computer, it's in a lot of TV shows now are very pornographic, like Game of Thrones. A lot of people like Game of Thrones, and I tried to watch it once and I couldn't watch it. It was pretty advanced pornography in there. But that's now become acceptable. So porn normativity, Ashley was talking about that porn normativity coming into the schools now, but that was preceded by porn normativity coming to our culture. We all kind of accepted pornography. And the amazing thing about England right now is they've declared pornography for children a public health crisis, and they're doing everything they can to keep kids from under 18 from accessing pornography. Now, I don't always look to England for my morals, but in this case, we should pay attention. And we should be doing everything we can in this country to bar access from pornography for our kids, but even adults. I mean, pornography is a huge cause of marital infidelity. It's a huge cause of divorce. So if we want to have better, stronger marriages and families, we need to do something with pornography. And the church is starting to deal with it, but we've got to deal with it on a bigger level. The family breakdown, no-fault divorce, and then we saw the rise of the LGBTQ back, 25 years ago when we first started dealing with it legally. They were asking for acceptance and tolerance of the alternative lifestyle. I call those the good old days, right? Accept our alternative lifestyle. And then we saw the rise of the request for domestic partnerships, and then marriage, the push for marriage. And then now, since marriage was legalized at the U.S. Supreme Court, we immediately saw them turn to start pushing transgenderism into public schools and start punishing people who didn't agree with them in that area, and the whole gender spectrum. And so this has been a quick tour of history. And part of legally the way they got their new rights recognized under the law is by trying to wrap themselves in the Black civil rights movement. And the way they did that is by telling a lie. And the lie they told that everybody believed, including the judges, even though there wasn't any medical or biological or scientific proof of it, is a mutability myth. That, hey, I'm born gay, just like black people are born black and women are born women, I'm born gay, and because I'm born gay, you need to treat me in a civil rights context. And so they won the battle for civil rights based on the lie, but we all went along with it. But I can tell you today, there actually just a study came out a couple days ago on twins that with almost conclusive proof that homosexuality is not genetic and it's not biological. So how do we end up here? The biblical worldview has been undermined across the culture. There's growing hostility towards Christianity. And unfortunately, the church's response to that pressure and that attack has been really wimpy. Our response has been pretty deplorable, I would say. We become increasingly afraid, increasingly silent, increasingly fearful, increasingly disengaged, increasingly weak. And in the name of love, right? We said, oh, if you speak out and speak the truth, that's going to be seen as unloving, right? Well, let's flip that idea, folks. I really believe that speaking the truth on this issue is the most loving thing we can do. And it's actually unloving to be silent, okay? And we need to say, because, very few people accuse me of being hateful, although they probably, it would fit their agenda to label me as hateful. But I want you to know I'm not motivated by hate. I'm motivated by love. Not just love of my kids and my grandkids, but love for your kids and your grandkids. And then you need to be, it's not that the church needs to love more, we need to love more in the sense of being kind and nice. We need to love more in the sense of speaking the truth, okay? And fighting for our kids and fighting for their future, and not just waving the white flag and giving up because we're going to be called a name. So I wrote an op-ed about that I can send you if you want it, when love overcomes fear. And really what we need is to have our love for other people overcome our fear. That's what the Lord has really convicted me that I need to love more. I need to love other people more, just like God loves people. And if you love other people, then you're going to do what Jesus did. What did Jesus say before he went to the cross? Greater love has no man than this, that he lays down his life for his friends. And we need to start sacrificially dealing with these issues. So truth is the most loving thing we can give someone else, including the gospel and the truth about God's design for sex. And so we need to stop withholding the truth from our kids and the next generation. Extreme sex ed, it's gotten pretty crazy, as you've seen with what Ashley showed you. I'll just hit it quickly. These groups that Ashley was mentioning, they actually believe this. You can look on their websites. Don't take my word for it. They believe that kids have an inalienable right to sex and sexual information. That they have the right, at whatever age they feel it's appropriate, the kid themselves, to have sex and to have all the adult catalog of information about sex. Okay, that's why they believe it's their job to give it to them, whether you want your kid to have that information or not. They want to end the gender binary. The gender binary is just a fancy word or phrase for maleness and femaleness. If you ever want to do a really bizarre thought experiment, think about what it would mean if we ended maleness and femaleness in our culture, right? It's beyond target bathroom issues, right? We're talking about a radical change. But that's what they're moving us towards with the gender spectrum. The gender spectrum is not an end in and of itself. The gender spectrum is a means to end maleness and femaleness and destroy the Judeo-Christian worldview. That's what this is all about. Polyamory was mentioned. That's group relationships or group marriage between maybe 2 men and 5 women, for example. They're pushing the boundaries further and further. Early sexualization of toddlers and infants. They want to do it for younger and younger kids. Advocates for Youth in Oceanside, parents there rose up and got it kicked out, temporarily at least, for kindergarten to 6th grade. But the ACLU wrote a letter pressuring them to put it back in. ACLU thinks it's a great idea to bring this information that Ashley was showing you to kindergartners through 6th grade. So really their ultimate goal is no taboos, no boundaries, where we really have a sexual free-for-all that includes all sorts of disgusting things, including pedophilia, okay? And I don't have time to go into the proof of that, but there's actually college, university level sociologists writing openly positively about pedophilia and how we should move towards that, okay? So really what we're looking at is sexual anarchy, where there are no sexual ethics, there are no sexual boundaries, there are no sexual mores or norms that we abide by as a culture anymore. Lawlessness. I mean, you look at Sodom and Gomorrah. If they get what they want, Sodom and Gomorrah will have nothing on us. And that's the kind of future they want us to move towards, and that we're moving towards rapidly, okay? Let me mention briefly our transgender moment. And you need to get the book that I mentioned, but I just want to talk briefly about it. Teaching children that gender or sex is determined by subjective feelings and thoughts as opposed to objective biology is not healthy, okay? Probably most of us in this room know that, but you can do the research on your own to realize it's not a healthy thing, no matter what they tell you. It's actually a mental disorder in the DSM manual. Gender dysphoria remains classified as a mental disorder by the American Psychiatric Association DSM manual. And there's a lot of good reasons why. One is that sex change is not possible. Dr. Paul McHugh, the distinguished professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University, counseled for over 30 years. Johns Hopkins did them, and he counseled some of the first people who were getting these sex change operations. Well, Johns Hopkins stopped doing them for 30 years, actually, until just recently they were pressured to start doing sex change operations by the culture again. But he was actually for sex change operations, and he actually started counseling these men and women who were trying to get sex changes, and realizing it was not, the outcomes were not healthy at all. Okay, and he says, he confirms the basic truth that gender is biologically determined and that sex change is biologically and medically impossible. Okay, those hormones and lopping off body parts that happen, the outcomes are not good. As I say here, he also notes that the emotional, psychological, and physical outcomes for transgender individuals are far from ideal and are predominantly very poor. And regarding childhood medical intervention, Dr. Paul McHugh solemnly warns, given that those close to 80% of such children would abandon their confusion and grow naturally into adult life if untreated, these medical interventions come close to child abuse. So I have a question for everyone. Why have we lost our bloody minds, and why are we promoting child abuse now in public education in California and across the nation? Why? It's happening on our watch. Okay, it's a big problem. So I'm going to keep rolling here. Who's behind the sexuality education? This was talked about by Ashley, so I'm just going to go really quickly through it. San Diego is a stronghold. Thank you so much. I meant to bring that up. San Diego Unified is a tough nut to crack, and it's why after doing this for 2 or 3 years, we still haven't defeated it there. But there's a close cooperation here between Advocates for Youth, the ACLU, Dr. Shirley Weber, and others. A lot of the funding for early childhood comprehensive sexuality education is being funded by George Soros and some of his liberal buddies. Some of the $18 billion he released about 6 to 8 months ago was going specifically for this issue. So there's a lot of money behind it. To show you how crazy these people are, I have an extensive quote here from SICUS. That's the Sexuality Information and Education Council of the United States. Here's their radical beliefs and goals. They recognize that good sexual and reproductive health is a human right. Okay, where's that in our Constitution? Is sexuality education anywhere in our Constitution? Anybody know? No. It's not in there, right? But they want us to all adopt and enjoy this new human right. They advance comprehensive sexuality education as a means of building a foundation of a long-term culture shift. Anytime somebody wants to shift the culture, we should pay attention. Where are they going to shift it from, and where are they going to shift it to? They use a rights-based framework to inform our approach. Here we go, reshaping cultural and societal narratives. So the Judeo-Christian worldview and man-woman marriage and two genders is all wrong. They want to change everything. Of sexuality and sexual and reproductive health. Here's where it becomes Marxist and almost communist. If you look at the language, if you know about communism like I do, I've studied it quite a bit. They say they want to reshape the narratives, and it says working to dismantle the systems of power and oppression. Okay, so everything you believe in, they're basically saying what you in this room probably believe about sexuality. They want to dismantle the systems of power and oppression. They want to silence your voice and replace your voice with something else and your ideas with something else. But remember, this isn't a casual issue. The ideas have consequences, okay? So they say, so even though, for example, CHIA, the law here in California, requires that abstinence be discussed and promoted, the groups actually creating these curriculum are not for abstinence. They say here, abstinence, and they equate abstinence-based education with religious education. They say they are stigmatizing and shame-based programs, according to SICUS, okay? So if you're teaching your kids at home to be abstinent until marriage, you're engaging, according to them, in a stigmatizing and shame-based educational opportunity with your child. The founder, not surprisingly, of SICUS is a former medical director at Planned Parenthood. I'm going to go through this really quick because Ashley hit on a lot of this already, but all the curriculum are in one way or the other promoting these issues. Advocates for Youth just happens to be one of the worst in California, but it's porn normative, and as we talked about, porn is highly addictive and destructive. There's porn links in the curriculum. It's not age appropriate. They're moving and blurring the lines on what's age appropriate and moving the boundaries back to kindergarten and pre-K. And the radicals actually want to get this to kids as soon as they can learn anything. So we're talking, 3, 4, 5 years old. It's graphic and dangerous sex promotion. There's detailed descriptions on the chart that she showed you of vaginal, anal, and oral sex. It's not medically accurate. Condoms are not safe for anal sex, and yet they promote it as a safe practice or marginally safe practice for children. It's bad information medically that's going to get them in trouble. It's dehumanizing and objectifying. It teaches kids to primarily view themselves and each other as sex objects for personal pleasure, right? They see each other kind of as pieces of meat, right? We're talking about the Me Too movement. Do you think this is going to help the Me Too movement or hurt the Me Too movement? I mean, think about it, right? If we see each other primarily as sex objects, what's that going to do to how children treat each other, not just as children, but as they go into adulthood? Rather than beautiful, wonderful people created in the image of God, the Imago Dei. It's gender destroying and gender blurring. There's active promotion of gender spectrum and gender dysphoria and transgender to kids. It's all normal and fine. They have gender coming out parties now in kindergarten classes. It's now everywhere in the public school. It undermines parents and family, obviously. Parental rights are protected by the U.S. Constitution, by the way, so we may have a lawsuit soon in California involving parental rights. It's anti-marriage, obviously. Promotes abortion, we mentioned that already, and it's anti-religious. And as a First Amendment constitutional attorney, this is what upsets me the most, is they not only promote, this values-free view of sex, but they actually attack religious people and religious ideas about human sexuality over and over again. So they impliedly attack your pastor, your youth pastor, your parents, anybody who has a view that's different than their status view of sexuality that they're promoting now. And it's coercive speech, because there's actually a CSB, California School Board Association policy that actually punishes teachers and students if they fail to address the person by the right pronoun or the gender, even if it's against biology and against truth and reality. So it coerces speech and ideas in violation of the First Amendment. So there's a lot of problems with the law. Okay, is my clicker working? Okay. So as I wrap up here, I just want to mention a couple other places it comes to bear. So now California is not actively immersing and indoctrinating public school children not only in sex education under the California Healthy Youth Act, but also through the history of social science courses, what's called the Fair Education Act and SB 48, and also health, the new health standards. And what SB 48 is it's basically LGBT hero history law you may have heard about several years ago. But now the curriculum, the framework and curriculum is rolling out from that. And they're highlighting LGBT heroes in classes. And I could talk a couple hours about that, and I did just up in Rockland a couple nights ago when I was in the Sacramento area helping parents prepare for a board meeting up there on SB 48. But then what the health framework is the health framework basically takes everything that Ashley showed you that's rolling out through the sex education curriculums and says, oh, we like this so much that we're gonna push it as early as we can into health courses. And by relabeling it as health, there's a question whether parents can even opt out of that because it's not sex education per se. So they're leveraging everything that they're doing now, and they're all cooperating together to indoctrinate your kids in as many classrooms as they can between kindergarten through 12th grade. And that's what they're trying to do, okay? So let's look quickly at the California Healthy Youth Act. That's what we've been talking about. It's a bad law, but the framework and textbooks and implementation of it have been much worse. So what happens is every step of the development of the law and then the framework and then the curriculum, the activists are involved pushing their agenda further and further and pushing the envelope further and further. So it was written by Dr. Shirley Weber, but what's cool is, and why I say welcome to the revolution is, parents all over the state of California are rising up against this stuff. All over the state. Like I said, I was in Rockland. There was a big Capitol rally about the health framework 2 weeks ago with over 500 to 700 parents there. So there's an awakening and an engagement that's happening that I've been praying for the last 2 or 3 years. You can opt out of most of the sex ed curriculum, but unfortunately most parents don't decide to, even after they see how bad the curriculum is, because they don't want their kids stigmatized by other kids and their teacher, okay? So this is a big problem. It now applies to charter schools, AB 2601, and starting in the past last year, and starting in this next school year, it's mandatory at charter schools. So if you took your kid out of a regular public school and thought you were going to protect them in the charter schools, all bets are off. And what's sad is a lot of Christians in the charter school movement did nothing to fight it or stop that bill. It's pretty sad. So real quick, the Fair Education Act, SB 48, was passed in 2011. That's an LGBT hero history law. There's a lot of problems with the bill, one of which is you're only allowed to say positive things about the heroes that you're talking about. So let's look at, for example, one of the heroes that's brought up in the curriculum, Harvey Milk. Mm-hmm. They praise Harvey Milk for being courageous enough to talk about his sexuality, but they never say that he was a pedophile, even though he's a known pedophile. So if we're going to get the history about people and call them up as wonderful examples, we've got to be balanced. And that curriculum is also anti-religious and anti-Christian, and it's too much too soon, and there's no opt-out, okay? But school districts, if they want to, can provide a voluntary opt-out to some of this stuff, and we're hoping that they do. The health education program, I'm not going to go through it, but all the problems that we've talked about with the other programs are there also, and I'll send you, again, my PowerPoint if you want it. The curriculum adoption process, I'm not going to go through, but if you have questions about that, you can ask me. But as we wrap up, I just want to kind of challenge and encourage you with a couple points. My PowerPoint works, right? First of all, join the revolution. Ashley invited you to before, and now I'm here inviting you also. So you need to be informed. You need to understand the law. You need to understand your local curriculum adoption process, because every school district is different. They're rolling it out in different ways, and they're rolling it out at different phases and different time frames, okay? So you need to understand what's the adoption process, what's a proposed and actual curriculum if there is one in place, and how to opt out. And one of the things that you can do is, even if your district does not allow an opt-out for history, social science, or for health, we can help talk to your district about adopting a broader opt-out policy. We have a really good policy. There's a lot of great websites. Respectculture.org is Concerned Parents of San Diego. There's also Informed Parents of North County. That includes Oceanside, and Informed Parents of California. That's really a statewide organization. So we encourage you to engage, and encourage those in your spheres of influence to engage and speak the truth in love and be bold and fight this. It's a very important issue. Educate others in your community, and then opt out. Even if your kid's going to be embarrassed, you need to protect your kids from this information. It's not healthy, good information at all. And then really persevere. You know, we didn't get here overnight, and we're not going to get out of this problem overnight. And as I said earlier, we need to not love less, we need to love more. We need to love our children and our neighbors' children and our grandchildren enough to stand up and speak out for them and do what's right, stand for what's right, good, and true. And really understand that this is countercultural, and that's okay. Jesus was countercultural, and he calls his disciples, if we're fully devoted followers of Jesus Christ, to be countercultural and to be biblical. And then the reason I think this is so important, and the reason I'm here, and I've spoken at 2 other events this week on these issues, is because I really believe that if we don't get a handle on this, this is culture destroying and civilization ending type stuff that's coming against our culture. And I think history will back me up on that. And finally, as I said earlier, silence is not loving. Here's a quote from one of my favorite guys, heroes, Pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak, not to act is to act. Thank you.